So before we get this conversation started, why doesn't everyone take a second to introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do as it relates to today's topic of suicide and persistent thoughts? So Chinwe, how about you go first?
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Chinwe Williams. I'm a licensed clinical therapist. I have for years and years worked with adolescents and their families. I also have a practice where I focus on stress and anxiety management, trauma recovery, and I still get to work with adolescents, but also young adults and adults.
And I am the founder of Curate Hope, which is a nonprofit that works with teen mental health. We speak in schools all across the country, doing school assembly programs and curriculums, all centered around mental health and mental health awareness.
Yeah. So essentially, Kate, Will and I are both mental health advocates, very strong advocates.
There you go.
Awesome. And you two work together in a lot of different ways. Can you share about that?
So we actually co-wrote a neat little book called Seen. And the book is geared towards parents and caregivers and really any caring adult who wants to help children and teenagers overcome anxiety and despair through the power of connection. And so because of the book, Will and I have gotten a chance to really travel all over the country and speak to different groups about the content of the book. And we get to have conversations like we are right now with you, Kate, through different podcasts and just different forms of media. It's been really exciting and kind of a whirlwind. What do you think, Will?
Yeah, for sure. We're also writing a brand new book that's going to be coming out next year that is on anxiety, and it's for teenagers. So it's all about anxiety, and it's going to be for teenagers.
Oh, that's fabulous. I know that I'm also a therapist, so I work with a ton of teenagers and they would love something like that, something tangible, a book that they could read, engage with. So that is awesome. I'm so glad that you guys are doing that. So the topic of suicide or imagining ending your life shows up whether we talk about it or not, right? There's plenty of music, movies, TV shows with messages about suicide and hopelessness. And, you know, a lot of those take place during the teenage years. And some teens are kind of the center at that, or they have friends that are walking through that. And I just feel like this is everywhere, right? It's everywhere we look. And why do you think that is? And what do you think that's telling us about the world that we're living in?
I mean, I think one, our world has a lot of problems and challenges as it is. With so much turmoil, it's really hard sometimes to see hope, especially because our brains, and Dr. Chinwe knows this as a psychotherapist, like our brains are wired towards this negativity bias. And so we tend to over-attach to the negative things a lot quicker and faster than the positive things. So with that lean and the amount of information that we're constantly getting, it's hard to see hope in today's world. And I think that's perpetuated a lot of what we see now, where it feels like all of this just seems to be more. It's not necessarily that the world's become more difficult. There's always been problems. The difference is bad things happened across the country 100 years ago, and we just didn't know about it. You know, we carried the weight of our local community, not the whole weight of the world. So it's, I think, perpetuated the feelings that we all feel nowadays.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's important to mention, Kate, that there's not like one single factor that really contributes to the rise in depression and despair and thoughts of suicide. There's so many different things that contribute to it. And Will and I talk about this quite often. It's exactly what he mentioned. The world feels scarier, a lot scarier than it did for us, and certainly for our parents. And our teens just have so much more access to information about the world. And if you think about some of the studies that have really come out that paints a good picture of what we're talking about from 2009 to 2021, American teenagers, high school students who say that they feel persistently sad rose from 26% in 2009 to 44%. And that's according to a recent CDC study. And there's so many different measures out there that show us that this is real. And so social media plays a part in this. It's not the only factor, but it's a significant factor, especially for teenage girls who are socialized to internalize everything that they're seeing, and then sometimes even measure their own success or their own body image against what they're seeing. And let's just face it, like, I speak very directly and boldly about this because this is what I hear in the therapy room. Ever since the pandemic, it just feels like the hits just keep coming and coming. We're coming out of the pandemic, but then we see this rash of shootings and gun violence. We see school violence, and that's impacting little kids as well as teenagers. And we're also just seeing wars, right? You know, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we think sometimes that teenagers are oblivious to these things, but they're not, and they're being impacted, I think, a lot more significantly than adults realize.
And I think it's so important that we're spending time to like name that of like, you know, we see you as a teenager, like we see that you are going through all of these things at all at the same time. And, you know, I don't think we take a lot of time to pause and say that we see you and we see the things that you're going through and how all of those complicated pieces are just stacking up on top of each other. And it makes sense that there's all this pain and hopelessness. And so I think on this too, you know, it's true that hopelessness can make everything seem even more hopeless, right? Just talking about the fact that everything is hopeless makes it just seem so much more and bigger and harder to kind of navigate, right? But as sort of experts and researchers in this area, like, do you see hope? Like, is it possible for things to be changed for the better?
That's a great question. We say all the time, there is always hope. And Chinwe says it probably, I don't know, 15 times a day, maybe to your clients. And yes. I say it to thousands of students when I speak in schools, and we wrote it in Scene, and we'll write it in the next book, because there truly is always hope. And, you know, I think of my friend Malik, who Malik experienced a loss of both of his parents really early on, like within a short amount of time. So he was a teenager, and at 17 and 19 experienced a loss of both of his parents. And that was really, really, really hard. He talks about often the feeling of just not even being able to get out of bed. He literally had to, you know, talk himself into just getting off the floor at times. Yeah. And the cool thing about Malik's story is, even though in that season of his life, he was in a really dark place of hopelessness, he chose hope by reaching out to someone he trusted. He chose hope by sharing with somebody that he knew cared about him, and just simply said 3 little words: "I'm not okay." Mm-hmm. And that phrase ultimately helped others around him to know that he needed help, he needed support. And so he chose hope by being honest about where he was. And that was a big, big step in Malik's story. And he's a good friend of mine. And so him and I talk a lot, you know, almost every week. And, you know, he still struggles with depression. He still struggles with anxiety. Mm-hmm. But he continues to choose hope, among other things, by going to therapy. He exercises on a regular basis, and he really tries to seek meaningful connection. So it's not that, you know, everything just magically got better for Malik. You know, the circumstances didn't necessarily change. But what did change was the way that he was reaching out, talking to someone, and the things that he continues to do. He's able to manage, you know, some of these things that he's facing and dealing with.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think that, we need to hear that there are things that we can do that kind of help us to feel better, but also manage some of those feelings and move towards hope. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Dr. Chinwe,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I love that story. I know Malik also not as well as Will, but I just love hearing that. And some of this I didn't even realize before today, because when you see him, I mean, he's a DJ and he gets not just students, but teachers on their feet doing all sorts of wild, crazy, dance moves to begin to open up the conversation about despair and depression and suicide in order to give people hope. So I just love that. And when you meet Malik, you would never even think about all the things that he has been through and is still overcoming. So I love that.
And sort of as we sort of wrap up today, I would love for you to look directly into your computer camera lens and share what is one final thing that you're hoping that our people watching here today can take away from this conversation? What's the one thing you want them to grab onto, remember, and carry with them as we work through this really hard topic?
For me, I want to say to every single teenager that is watching or listening to this conversation and is experiencing some degree of sadness or despair or even depression, and maybe you are having some of those dark thoughts. And one thing I know in my career and even personal experience, when you have those dark thoughts, they turn around and point the blame on you. Like there's something that you haven't done enough of. And what I want you to know is that depression, despair is not your fault. So that's the biggest thing that I want to say. And then number two is help is available. We know that more than anything, social connections help to buffer the effects of stress and anxiety and sadness. And it's really hard to reach out, but kind of going back to the Malik story, even via text, if you can just say 2 or 3 words, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. And if someone asks and if someone reaches out to you, letting them know exactly how you're doing can make all the difference in the world. So that's really what I want to share.
Yeah. And I would say there is always hope. Don't make a permanent decision on a temporary feeling, because what we feel today won't always be what we feel. There is tomorrow, and tomorrow can be very different. And talk to someone, talk to a trusted adult, reach out for help, just like Dr. Chinwe was saying, just like Malik did. That's the number one thing that we can do. And if you know someone that's hurting or someone that's thinking about hurting themselves, to talk to a trusted adult as well, because intervention, just talking to somebody about what we're feeling, is 50% of the work. It changes the brain chemistry when we feel love and we feel seen by someone that cares about us.
And I find that talking about it makes it real too. It's always real what we're feeling. That's always real. That's always a part of who we are. And when we say it out loud to someone that we trust and care about, there's a moment that happens with that brain chemistry that you shared. That's just hey, I'm able to name this. I'm able to say that this is what's happening. And then now I can figure out what to do. Keeping it inside and bottling it up is never going to be helpful. So I love that that's kind of where we're landing of talking, reaching out for support, and remembering that there's all kinds of things that we can do to find hope and find the purpose that we have for living into tomorrow. So I'm really grateful for both of you for the work that you do. Thank you so much for taking some time to sit with us and share your experiences. We're thankful for Malik and his story. I think that is so great to hear. And I hope that we can continue to be supportive and be here for students.
And thank you for what you're doing, Kate, and the rest of the team. Really important conversations that we have to have and elevate. And then just finally, I want to mention that there is a number now, a 3-digit number, 988, that you can call as a teenager, or that if you're concerned about some of your thoughts and feelings, or maybe those of your friends, you can call and speak to a trained professional who will help you kind of walk through next steps. So we definitely want to mention that.
Yeah.